In the long-forgotten archives of Ulster County, New York, hidden under decades of official silence, sits a report that has unsettled every clerk daring enough to read it. Dated 1867. It details the inspection of the House of Religious Correction for wayward women and lays bare 3 decades of systematic abuse inflicted on 456 women. What makes this record so horrifying is not only the cruelty it describes, but the fact that 3 siblings, Patrick, Kathleen, and Sean Hudson, managed to convince an entire community that their brutal methods were acts of divine mercy. The state legislature sealed the files and buried them so deep that most historians have never even heard of the Hudson family's reign of terror. But tonight, we are going to dig up the truth about what may have been America's most sinister religious institution, a place where salvation was nothing more than slavery in disguise. Before we step deeper into the Hudson family's house of horrors, let me remind you that this channel is dedicated to uncovering the darkest and most chilling stories buried in America's past. If you are fascinated by the shadows behind our history, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. And drop a comment to let me know where you are tuning in from. I would love to hear if your town has its own dark legends worth investigating. The story of the Hudsons begins not with madness, but with the appearance of pious devotion, which makes their crimes even more disturbing. In the 1830s, New York State was swept up in the spirit of the Second Great Awakening, a wave of religious fervor that gave birth to countless new churches, societies, and reform movements. It was an era when communities believed that sin and immorality could be beaten back with prayer discipline and unwavering faith. Ulster County in the Hudson River Valley embodied this crusading spirit. Its county seat, Kingston, was home to 13 churches, 4 temperance societies, and a reputation for strict Christian virtue. The surrounding farms still clung to old Calvinist traditions passed down for generations, and these were people convinced that moral corruption was as contagious as disease and sometimes required extreme measures to protect the community. Into this atmosphere walked Patrick Hudson in the spring of 1834 with his wife Kathleen and his younger brother Sean. Patrick was a tall, severe man with piercing gray eyes and prematurely white hair that lent him an almost prophetic aura. At 38, he carried himself like someone who had fought sin and triumphed over it. Kathleen, 3 years younger, had a striking marble-like beauty, with pale skin, sharp features, and a stern presence that seemed carved from stone. Sean, barely 25, had soft, almost angelic features, and a gentle manner that masked a far more dangerous reality. The Hudson siblings arrived with letters of recommendation from Massachusetts ministers praising Patrick's innovative approaches to moral correction. He spoke with conviction about founding a place where fallen women could be redeemed through disciplined prayer and what he described as purification rituals. Reform institutions were nothing new in that period, but Patrick's proposal stood out because it promised spiritual healing, not just punishment. The local clergy and magistrates were impressed by his theological depth and his apparent commitment to charity. When he purchased an old Dutch colonial mansion outside Kingston that had fallen into ruin, the community took it as a sign of divine blessing. The house had been built in 1712 and stood on 47 acres, surrounded by dense woods. Its thick stone walls and cellar chambers seemed perfectly suited to Patrick's vision of prayer rooms and solitary reflection spaces. Throughout that summer, the Hudsons transformed the estate. Patrick oversaw renovations, installing locks and barred windows under the guise of protecting the residents from fleeing before redemption. Kathleen devised strict daily schedules of prayer work and meals that left no moment unstructured. Sean designed a spiritual curriculum he claimed would cleanse the most wayward souls. Local leaders praised their effort. Ministers spoke highly of Patrick's emphasis on scripture-based therapy, while the county judge, Hendrik Schuyler, admired his willingness to take on the most difficult women whom other institutions had given up on. By the fall of 1834, the House of Religious Correction for Wayward Women was ready to open its doors, and the Ulster County Gazette published a glowing article hailing it as a beacon of Christian hope for society's most forsaken daughters. The Hudson family made it clear from the start that they would accept no government support. Instead, they relied on private donations and what Patrick described as contributions from families desperate to see their wayward daughters reformed. The first of those daughters arrived on a cold November morning in 1834. 19-year-old Margaret Sutherland, daughter of a wealthy merchant, had been discovered in what her father called compromising circumstances with a married man. Faced with the shame of scandal, he delivered her to Patrick Hudson's doorstep, paying handsomely for what he believed would be a year-long program of moral rehabilitation. With the heavy oak doors closing behind her, Margaret vanished into the Hudson mansion. Her father never saw her again, though for months he received letters in her handwriting, assuring him that her redemption was progressing according to God's will. What he could not know was that Margaret had become the first victim of a system so cruel that investigators decades later would be shaken to their core. The House of Religious Correction for Wayward Women was about to reveal its true face. Far from a sanctuary, it would become a place where Christian virtue provided the perfect disguise for exploitation and abuse. Margaret's transformation began within hours of her arrival. On that November night, with rain hammering the mansion's narrow windows, she was introduced to what she would later describe in sworn testimony as her first glimpse of hell. Patrick Hudson received her in the grand parlor, where a roaring fire cast flickering shadows across wooden beams and faded biblical verses painted on the walls. He wore plain black clothing, his sharp features softened by a practiced expression of compassion. Speaking with the cadence of a seasoned preacher, he told her she had come as Magdalene had come to Christ, broken by sin but ready for redemption. Her father had entrusted them with her soul, he said, and though the path would be difficult, it would lead to purification. Kathleen Hudson entered soon after, tall and severe, in her high-collared black dress, a silver cross pinned at her throat. Her icy blue eyes measured Margaret like a farmer sizing livestock. The first step, she explained, was the surrender of vanity. Margaret would give up her possessions and even her clothes, trading them for plain garments that marked her new status as a penitent. From the shadows stepped Sean Hudson, his soft features and gentle voice radiating what seemed like genuine kindness. He spoke to her as if he understood her fear, assuring her that resistance was the devil's whisper, and that she need only place her trust in them to find salvation. His words soothed her, but the promise of compassion was only bait. What followed was something Margaret never forgot, though she would not reveal it until 33 years later, when investigators forced the truth into the open. She was taken to what Patrick called the preparation chamber, a windowless room buried deep in the mansion's cellar. It was there, in that suffocating darkness, that the Hudsons began the ritual they claimed would purify her soul. The so-called preparation chamber had once been the mansion's root cellar, its stone walls damp with seepage, no matter how Patrick tried to dress it up. Candles cast a weak glow, their light bending across crosses and paintings of damned souls writhing in torment, each one meant to remind new arrivals what awaited the unredeemed. Margaret was ordered to strip away the clothes she had worn from home and replace them with a coarse gray shift embroidered with the words, "Penitent Soul." Her hair was cut short, not brutally hacked away, but trimmed just enough to erase vanity. Jewelry money, even private letters, were locked in a box that Patrick promised would be returned once her redemption was complete. That promise, of course, was a lie. At first, the intake process looked like something she might endure. But what came next revealed the truth behind the Hudson family's institution. Kathleen conducted what she chillingly called the examination of moral corruption. With clinical calm, she handled the procedure like a doctor cataloging an illness, insisting that sin left marks upon the body as well as the soul. Margaret was prodded, measured, and inspected her answers to invasive questions, carefully recorded in a leather journal. Her history, her cycles, even her physical reactions, each detail treated as evidence of spiritual decay. While Kathleen broke down her body, Sean dismantled her mind. In a soft, pastoral voice that sounded more confessional than accusatory, he asked her to relive moments of shame. When did the devil first whisper in your ear, Margaret? What was the moment you first felt sinful desire? He spoke as though he had already heard it all, as though nothing could shock him. That pretense of compassion only made his words more dangerous, luring her into a false intimacy that left her defenses crumbling. By the time Margaret was allowed to rest, she had been stripped not just of her clothes and possessions, but of her dignity. She lay awake in a dormitory crowded with other women, listening to quiet sobs muffled by stone walls and strange noises echoing down the corridors. Already she understood that this was no place of moral rehabilitation. It was a prison disguised as a sanctuary. Her name, her identity, even her will now belonged to the Hudsons. She was no longer Margaret Sutherland, the merchant's daughter. She was simply a penitent soul under their control. What she could not know that first night was that she had just completed the opening act of a carefully designed system. Every intake was a ritual perfected over time to erase selfhood and replace it with obedience. Scripture provided cover discipline, disguised cruelty, and suffering was renamed purification. The genius of the Hudsons was not their brutality. It was how they cloaked it in religion so thoroughly that no one outside dared question them. By the winter of 1834, the machine was in motion. Margaret's ordeal became the template for every woman who followed. Morning prayers were twisted into psychological drills. Bible study reinforced submission. Labor was masked as discipline while producing goods for profit. And by spring of 1835, 12 women aged 16 to 31 lived within the mansion's walls, each one enduring the same systematic cycle of control. The women sent to the Hudsons were those whose very existence had become a source of shame to their families. Daughters caught in scandal, wives exposed for adultery, young women with pregnancies that marked them as outcasts. Families paid enormous sums for what they were told was a strict but holy rehabilitation program. Few ever questioned why the letters they received were nearly identical in tone, or why visits were discouraged with the warning that outside contact might disrupt the fragile process of spiritual healing. Life inside the House of Religious Correction followed a rigid schedule designed by Patrick Hudson to enforce control while also turning a profit. The women woke before dawn to prayers led by Sean in the mansion's chapel, where his sermons hammered the same themes over and over: female weakness, the dangers of desire, and the necessity of absolute submission to male authority. Afterward came a meager breakfast of thin porridge before 6 hours of hard labor. Under Kathleen's watch, the women produced fine embroidery, preserved foods, and other goods that she sold to wealthy families across the Hudson Valley. Their desperation made their work flawless, and the sales combined with family fees made the Hudson enterprise highly profitable, even as they insisted it was an act of Christian charity. It was the evenings, however, that revealed the true horror of the Hudson system. After supper and another round of prayers, the women were summoned to the mansion's basement, where Patrick had transformed the cellars into a labyrinth of chambers. The largest, which he named the Sanctuary of Purification, blended crosses and scripture with iron restraints and devices he claimed were needed to subdue sinful impulses during counseling. The smaller rooms served as private therapy chambers, their thick stone walls ensuring that whatever happened inside could not be heard beyond them. Margaret Sutherland later testified that the nightly sessions began as if they were genuine spiritual conversations. Sean would speak to her with quiet concern, asking about her struggles, her fears, her desires. But the questions were designed to expose her weaknesses, to uncover the exact pressure points that would break her will. He had a gift, she said, almost supernatural, for knowing exactly what you were thinking and what it would take to make you surrender. He used the scripture like a weapon, convincing the women that resisting him was not resistance to man, but to God himself. The physical side of these sessions was just as insidious. Kathleen presented herself as an authority on female health and claimed her spiritual examinations were essential to measure each woman's progress. The procedures were invasive, humiliating, and served no medical purpose. Yet Kathleen framed them as treatments for the impurities left by sin. Our bodies were temples, she would tell them, but temples defiled must be cleansed through suffering and purification. And because she spoke with such calm certainty, the women believed her. To resist was to risk damnation. Over time, the manipulation deepened, breaking down every last bit of resistance. By the summer of 1835, the population had grown to 20 women, enough for Patrick to introduce what he privately called his redemption service program. Wealthy men, merchants, landowners, and pillars of society were invited as supposed benefactors, told that their generous donations and personal guidance could accelerate the rehabilitation of fallen women. In truth, they were paying for sanctioned access, exploiting the women under the cover of religious charity. The women were told these encounters were essential training lessons in the submissive obedience expected of them when they returned to society. Those who resisted were punished and kept longer, while those who complied were offered small comforts and the hope of release. It was a system so cruelly efficient that the women themselves came to cling to the illusion that their pain had meaning. As Margaret later told investigators, "We wanted to believe that every humiliation was bringing us closer to purity. Because if we admitted the truth that it was nothing but torture and exploitation, then there was no hope at all." By 1836, the House of Religious Correction had become a pillar of Ulster County's moral reform movement. Local ministers praised the Hudsons for their generosity, pointing to their donations to churches and missionary projects. Judge Schuyler, convinced of the program's success, routinely recommended the institution to families desperate to hide scandal. On the surface, the Hudsons looked like model Christians. But behind that facade, they had perfected a system of control built on manipulation, torture, and exploitation. What had begun as one young woman's nightmare had evolved into a machine that consumed lives with terrifying efficiency. The Hudsons had learned how to weaponize shame and faith. They could read their victims' fears, identify their weaknesses, and then use religion itself as a cage. Every month, more women vanished behind the mansion's locked doors, and every month the family's network of wealthy clients grew larger. It was no longer just abuse, it was enterprise. In 1836, subtle changes signaled just how far the Hudsons were willing to go. Expansion began. Patrick announced that demand for their services had grown so great, they needed new dormitories and workshops. Through the spring and summer, local craftsmen erected additional buildings on the estate. Outwardly, they were framed as signs of success. In reality, they were the final pieces of a system designed to industrialize suffering. The so-called Advanced Therapy Center was built with private entrances for clients and soundproof walls, making it the ideal setting for the most profitable part of their operation, the Redemption Service Program. The second new building, named the Contemplation Retreat, was far darker. It was a prison for those who resisted, with isolation cells and basement purification chambers reserved for the most brutal therapy sessions. Margaret Sutherland, still trapped after 18 months, watched the expansion with dread. The girl who had once arrived in defiance was gone. Survival had replaced resistance. She complied not because she believed in their methods, but because she had seen what happened to those who didn't. Some women vanished, supposedly sent to other institutions, or placed in domestic service. Others were broken in the basement and returned as empty shells, agreeing to anything to avoid being sent back. Those disappearances began in late 1835, but their true meaning wasn't understood until decades later. Patrick had created what he called advanced placement programs. Families were told their daughters had been transferred or graduated into service, complete with cheerful letters confirming their success. In truth, many of these women were sold into city brothels or quietly murdered when they became a liability. Sean handled the deception with unnerving skill. During intake, he studied each woman's handwriting, vocabulary, and tone, then later forged letters so convincing that families never doubted their authenticity. His gift for mimicry gave the Hudsons the perfect cover to keep their victims invisible. Margaret would later describe him as the most terrifying of the siblings. Patrick was openly cruel. Kathleen was cold. But Sean was evil disguised as virtue. With soft eyes and a gentle voice, he could convince you that suffering was holy, that degradation was purification, that despair was hope. By autumn of 1836, the House of Religious Correction held 37 women, making it one of the largest institutions of its kind in New York State. The Hudson's empire was now funded not only by family fees and the sale of women's labor, but also by the enormous profits of the Redemption Service Program. What had begun as opportunistic cruelty had transformed into something far more chilling, a thriving business built on the destruction of human lives. By late 1836, the Hudsons had become more than reformers. They were local celebrities. Patrick used his growing profits to buy property across Ulster County and cultivate business connections that made him look like a pillar of the community. Ministers invited him to speak at conferences about his groundbreaking work in moral correction. Kathleen was sought out by other churchwomen for advice on charitable projects. And Sean, with his soft-spoken manner and polished sermons, was being considered for ordination. The Hudsons were everything the community wanted them to be: pious, charitable, successful. Behind that perfect facade, however, the truth was far darker. The Hudsons had refined their system of exploitation into a seamless enterprise. They knew how to shatter a woman's identity in months. They had networks for disposing of troublesome residents, forged letters that fooled even attentive families, and a business model that blended religion, sexual exploitation, human trafficking, and murder into one profitable machine. What made them truly dangerous wasn't just the cruelty, it was their conviction that it was all justified. Patrick told himself he was removing corruption from society. Kathleen believed she was pioneering new methods of understanding female psychology. Sean convinced himself he was carrying out God's will. Every act of abuse was reframed as holy. Every violation became a sacrament. Every disappearance was explained as mercy. By the winter of 1836, Margaret Sutherland and the other women inside the House of Religious Correction knew the truth: they were never meant to be rehabilitated. The Hudson family's grip was tightening, and escape seemed impossible. But just as the family's power peaked, unexpected visitors arrived that would shake the empire they had built. In February of 1837, the New York State Commission on Charitable Institutions sent investigators to Kingston. The commission had been created after a string of scandals in other reform houses, and its mandate was clear: investigate in any institution taking public referrals or serving families from multiple counties. Commissioner Henry Caldwell, a seasoned lawyer from Albany, arrived with 2 assistants and a file of troubling reports about the Hudson mansion. Families had complained of daughters being kept far longer than promised. Others reported identical letters arriving from different women. Some said they had been denied visits altogether. In all, 17 inquiries had been filed. Patrick was warned in advance by Judge Schuyler, his longtime ally, and rushed to prepare. He believed he could outmaneuver these inspectors, just as he had brushed aside past questions. But he underestimated Caldwell. Unlike other officials, Caldwell wasn't interested in pious speeches or glowing testimonials. He planned to examine the institution's records, its finances, and its treatment methods in detail. For the first time in years, the Hudsons felt real fear. Patrick activated what he called emergency protocols. The basement chambers were stripped of restraints and redecorated to resemble storage areas. Religious paintings were repositioned to hide damage on the walls. Medical-looking equipment was placed where chains had once hung. The private rooms in the so-called Advanced Therapy Center were rearranged to look like dormitories. Records of wealthy clients were burned or hidden. But the most chilling preparations involved the women themselves. Those who had been held the longest, the ones who had seen the worst of the Hudsons' methods, were suddenly transferred to supposed satellite facilities. In reality, many were sold to brothels in distant cities or silenced permanently. It was a desperate attempt to erase witnesses before the commission could set foot inside the mansion. The Hudsons had built an empire of exploitation under the shield of Christian respectability. Now, for the first time, that shield was about to be tested, and they would stop at nothing to keep their secrets buried. By her third year inside the House of Religious Correction, Margaret Sutherland had become too dangerous to keep around. She knew too much. On the night before Commissioner Caldwell's visit, she and 11 other long-term residents were packed into covered wagons for what Patrick called emergency transfers. Margaret knew what that meant. "I knew that night we were going to die," she would later testify. The Hudsons no longer needed to pretend these women might someday be released. They weren't assets anymore, they were liabilities. But fate intervened. The wagon carrying Margaret broke down, forcing her guards to seek shelter at the farmhouse of Samuel Hartwell, a Quaker minister who had long distrusted the Hudson institution. Hartwell had heard whispers that didn't match the image of Christian charity the Hudsons projected. When he saw Margaret's frail body, the marks of abuse, the terror in her eyes, he knew instantly she was a victim, not a penitent. "Brother Hartwell saved my life that night," Margaret would recall. He refused to let the guards take her further and instead placed her under the protection of abolitionist allies who specialized in helping women escape violent captivity. While Margaret's life was being spared, Commissioner Caldwell was stepping into the Hudson mansion. Patrick welcomed him with polished charm, confident his emergency protocols had erased any trace of the institution's darkest secrets. He showed Caldwell converted dormitories, coached residents, and carefully scrubbed financial records. To most observers, it might have looked convincing. But Caldwell wasn't like other inspectors. He noticed the fear in residents' eyes, the rehearsed cadence of their testimonies, the strange alterations in the mansion's basement rooms. The money trail looked off too, income far too high for a purely charitable enterprise. What truly alarmed him, however, were the population records. According to Hudson's books, more than 30 women had supposedly completed rehabilitation and entered domestic service in the past year. Yet families reported no such placements. When Caldwell pressed for proof, Sean produced letters from these graduates. They looked authentic at first glance, but Caldwell noticed the handwriting varied strangely, while the vocabulary and phrasing remained nearly identical. When he asked to contact the families, Sean hid behind a claim of confidentiality that contradicted their supposed mission of reunification. Caldwell's suspicions deepened. As the second day of the inspection wore on, Patrick realized his careful cover story might not hold. Worse news soon reached him. Margaret Sutherland was alive, sheltered at Hartwell's farm, and already speaking with abolitionist allies who would not hesitate to bring her story to light. For the first time in years, the Hudson machine trembled. The siblings responded in ways that revealed the cracks in their masks. Patrick spiraled into desperation, sending men to snatch Margaret back by any means necessary, and even plotting Commissioner Caldwell's death, imagining it could be blamed on winter bandits. Kathleen retreated into obsession, frantically burning incriminating ledgers while preserving the journals she believed were her life's work. Meticulous notes on women's suffering that she considered groundbreaking research. Sean's calm, pastoral veneer began to collapse, his soft voice giving way to the cold precision of a predator cornered. The empire the Hudsons had built on fear and faith was beginning to unravel. And with Margaret alive, sheltered by people willing to expose the truth, their reign of terror was closer to its end than they could admit. As the day of reckoning drew near, the mask of Christian benevolence the Hudsons had worn for years began to slip. Sean, once the soft-spoken shepherd of broken souls, became something far more terrifying. In those final days, he abandoned the gentle tone that had charmed ministers and residents alike, replacing it with threats laced with open contempt. If any of you speak to the investigators, he warned, you'll be sent to places that will make this house seem like paradise. Survivors would later testify that his pastoral mask was gone, and what remained was raw hatred. Just when the depths of the Hudson family's depravity seemed fully revealed, desperation pushed them further still. On February 18, 1837, word reached the mansion that Margaret Sutherland was alive, sheltered by Quaker abolitionists and already sharing her story. The news struck the family like lightning. For years they had relied on secrecy and manipulation to keep their empire intact. Now, for the first time, someone who had lived through it all was free to testify. Patrick's response was immediate and ruthless. He dispatched his most loyal enforcers, men who had served as the muscle behind the institution's walls, to retrieve Margaret by force. These were no men of God, they were hardened criminals who had found profit and pleasure in the Hudson system of exploitation. But Samuel Hartwell and his Quaker allies were not defenseless. Tied into the Underground Railroad, they had both networks and weapons. When Patrick's men reached the Hartwell farm, they found it defended by abolitionists who were prepared for exactly this kind of assault. Shots were fired. The attempted abduction failed. The attack exposed the truth. When Commissioner Caldwell learned that Hudson men had staged an armed assault on a Quaker farm to seize a witness, he understood immediately that this was no case of financial irregularities. He was staring at an organized criminal conspiracy hiding under the cloak of religious reform. Back inside the mansion, panic hardened into cruelty. Sean launched what he called final purification ritual sessions, meant not to save souls, but to terrorize the women into silence. He described what would happen to us if the house was closed, survivor Sarah Peaton later testified. He told us of places where we'd be sent where no one would ever find us. He made our current suffering seem merciful by comparison. Kathleen's response was chilling in its own way. While her brothers raged and schemed, she buried herself in her notes. To her, the crisis was not about survival or justice, but about preserving what she considered valuable research, meticulous records of women's suffering and psychological collapse. She burned ledgers that might incriminate the family, yet carefully saved her journals, convinced that history would someday vindicate her work as scientific contribution rather than sadistic cruelty. Caldwell, realizing the scale of what he had uncovered, requested reinforcements. He began tracing the Hudsons' ties to ministers, judges, and wealthy patrons across the state. The investigation would eventually reveal a sprawling network: human trafficking, sexual exploitation, financial fraud, even murder, masked as a charitable mission. But before that full picture could come into focus, the Hudsons made one last desperate gamble. They moved to destroy the evidence and silence the witnesses once and for all. Margaret's testimony had become the linchpin. If she spoke, the empire would fall. If she was silenced, the house of religious correction might endure. The stage was set. On February 25, 1837, during a blizzard so fierce it would be remembered for generations, the Hudson family's empire of exploitation collided with the forces determined to bring it down. The blizzard of February 1837 gave Patrick Hudson the perfect cover for what he intended as the final act of his empire. His plan was ruthless: eliminate every witness, destroy all evidence, and vanish with his fortune, leaving behind only charred ruins to be remembered as a tragic accident. By then, Margaret Sutherland's testimony had been recorded in Kingston and corroborated by physical evidence from the Hartwell farm. Commissioner Caldwell was building what promised to be the largest criminal case in New York's history. But Patrick would not allow the truth to survive the storm. He had spent years building a private network of enforcers, corrupt officials, hardened criminals, and desperate men compromised by their role in his schemes. On the night of February 18th, as the snow fell in suffocating sheets, Patrick unleashed them in a coordinated assault on 3 fronts. The courthouse, where Caldwell directed his investigation. The Hartwell farm, where Margaret and her protectors sheltered. And the house of religious correction itself, where 23 residents remained living witnesses too dangerous to leave alive. At the courthouse, Patrick himself led men disguised as federal marshals. Their goal was simple: kill Caldwell and burn the evidence. The ambush nearly worked. Caldwell was shot twice and only survived thanks to local militia who rushed in after hearing the gunfire. At the Hartwell farm, Sean Hudson led another attack determined to kill Margaret and anyone who had heard her story. The defenders fought fiercely, but they were outnumbered. The farmhouse was set ablaze, forcing Quakers and fugitives alike to fight their way out into the snow. 3 abolitionists, including Samuel Hartwell, died buying Margaret's escape. But the most chilling horror unfolded back at the Hudson mansion. Kathleen, faced with the collapse of her life's work, decided to erase every trace of it, including the women themselves. That night, she poisoned the evening meal with arsenic she had been hoarding for months. Survivors later testified that she served the food while preaching a sermon about the cleansing power of suffering, telling them their deaths would be the final act of purification, preparing their souls for heaven. To her, it was not murder. It was mercy. But her calculation was flawed. The dose did not kill quickly. Instead, it left most of the women writhing in agony, conscious as the poison tore through their bodies. Their screams echoed through the stone halls, a chorus of suffering that haunted the few survivors forever. Only 4 women too ill to eat that night lived to tell what happened. Patrick returned to the mansion in the early hours to find his empire collapsing. Caldwell had survived. Federal marshals were flooding into Ulster County. His associates were dead or captured. And worst of all, Margaret Sutherland had escaped yet again, her testimony strengthened by the blood sacrifice of those who had died to protect her. Faced with total ruin, Patrick chose a final act of destruction. He would not flee, nor would he surrender. Instead, he turned the mansion itself into a funeral pyre. He doused the wooden floors with lamp oil, piled papers and ledgers into kindling, and wrote a final testament in which he cast himself not as a criminal, but as a misunderstood prophet. In his mind, the fire would cleanse everything, sealing his legacy in flames and smoke. Patrick Hudson's final testament revealed the depth of his delusion. "I have devoted my life to the sacred work of purifying fallen women and restoring them to Christian virtue," he wrote. The corrupt world has rejected my methods because they lack the courage to acknowledge the extreme measures necessary to cleanse souls tainted by sin. History will vindicate my work. Hours later, the mansion he had turned into a machine of suffering was engulfed in flames. The fire began just before dawn on February 26, 1837, as the blizzard finally subsided. Patrick perished in the inferno alongside his brother Sean, who had returned from the failed Hartwell assault to join what he saw as a final act of defiance. Kathleen alone escaped captured while trying to flee with a wagon filled not with the belongings of her victims, but with her journals and research notes. The Hudson family's reign of terror had ended in ash, but the reckoning had only begun. For days, the smoldering ruins of the House of Religious Correction sent smoke into the gray sky, a grim monument to 3 years of cruelty disguised as charity. Margaret Sutherland's survival and testimony ensured that the story would not vanish with the fire. Her words became the cornerstone of what soon grew into the largest criminal investigation in New York State's history. Despite being wounded in the assault on the courthouse commissioner, Henry Caldwell directed the probe personally, leading a team of marshals and state investigators who spent months piecing together the truth. The evidence was staggering. Records from Patrick's properties showed that between 1834 and 1837, the Hudsons had generated more than $47,000, an enormous fortune at the time, through forced labor, family fees, trafficking women into brothels, and the so-called Redemption Service Program. But the most disturbing discoveries came from Kathleen's surviving papers. Her journals, meticulously preserved, read like a manual for systematic human degradation. She had documented every method of breaking her victims' resistance: isolation, humiliation, manipulation, abuse. Each woman's reactions were studied and categorized as though they were laboratory specimens instead of human beings. Commissioner Caldwell described her notes as a deliberate and scientific approach to exploitation, unlike anything encountered in our investigation of other criminal enterprises. Survivors like Margaret provided the human face behind those records. Their testimonies showed how religious authority had been weaponized, how scripture had been twisted into chains, and how intelligent, capable women had been broken down until they believed their torment was holy. Dr. Samuel Richardson, one of the first physicians to study trauma, later wrote, "Margaret's account demonstrated how psychological manipulation can convince victims to participate in their own exploitation. It revealed how faith itself can be transformed into a weapon." The trial of Kathleen Hudson drew international attention. She was the only surviving sibling, and her case raised a haunting question: how do you prosecute crimes committed under the guise of religion? Witnesses described her as detached, clinical, obsessed with the value of her research. Some experts argued she was insane. Others insisted she was simply a person stripped of conscience. Kathleen herself seemed bewildered by the outrage. She testified not with remorse, but with regret that her work had been cut short. "I have devoted my life to understanding the female mind and developing effective methods for correcting moral deficiencies," she told the court. "My only sorrow is that my studies ended before they were complete." Her words, cold and clinical, shocked even her own attorneys. To the jury, they confirmed what survivors already knew. Kathleen Hudson was not just complicit in her family's crimes, she was their architect. Kathleen Hudson never wavered in her belief that her work had been justified. "Every woman who entered our institution was already fallen," she insisted. "My methods may have seemed harsh to those who lacked scientific training, but they were grounded in careful observation and systematic experimentation." To the very end, she framed her cruelty as science. Her 6-week trial drew crowds from across the state. Some came to witness justice. Others simply wanted to see the woman newspapers had dubbed the Ulster County she-devil. The testimony was harrowing, the evidence overwhelming. Kathleen was convicted on charges of murder, kidnapping, fraud, and what prosecutors called a criminal conspiracy cloaked in the guise of religion. Her sentence was unprecedented. In November 1838, she became one of the first women in New York history to be executed for crimes committed under the mantle of religious authority. She met her end on the gallows with composure, refusing to speak publicly. Instead, her final statement, read aloud by the prison chaplain, defended her methods as necessary innovations misunderstood by a world too timid to face the realities of human nature. But the Hudsons' downfall did not end with her death. Investigators uncovered a sprawling web of corruption that stretched far beyond Ulster County. Judges, ministers, and businessmen had all profited from or enabled the family's crimes. More than 40 people were prosecuted, their trials exposing the deep rot hidden beneath a veneer of piety and respectability. The scandal sparked sweeping reforms across New York State. Known as the Hudson Reforms, the new laws mandated inspections, standardized records, and outside oversight for all institutions that claimed to provide moral or medical care. Other states soon followed. The principle was clear: religious authority would no longer shield criminal behavior. Margaret Sutherland, the young woman whose survival and testimony had shattered the Hudsons' empire, transformed tragedy into purpose. She married Thomas Hartwell, the son of the Quaker, who had saved her life and devoted herself to reform work. Through Quaker networks, she helped women escape abusive institutions and find safe refuge. In 1845, she published her memoir, one of the earliest first-hand accounts of systematic psychological abuse. Her book shaped legal precedent, gave voice to survivors, and stood as a warning of how easily compassion could be weaponized into control. The House of Religious Correction itself was never rebuilt. Its ruins were left to rot, a scar on the landscape and a reminder too painful to erase. Locals stripped its stones for barns and farmhouses, as if dismantling the very memory of what had happened there. Yet no one would settle the land, and for decades the site remained abandoned, shunned as cursed ground. But the legacy of the Hudson case reached far beyond Ulster County. It shattered blind faith in institutions that claimed divine purpose, forcing churches and charities alike to face demands for transparency. It laid the groundwork for future prosecutions against religious figures who used their pulpits as shields for exploitation. It offered early insight into psychological manipulation and trauma long before modern science had a name for it. Or perhaps the most sobering lesson came from Dr. Samuel Richardson, who studied the case in depth. The Hudsons did not succeed because they were brilliant criminals, he wrote. They succeeded because people wanted to believe in redemption. They chose to look away from signs of evil when those signs contradicted their cherished faith in Christian charity. Evil thrives not only through deception, but through the willingness of good people to ignore what they do not wish to see. The House of Religious Correction burned to the ground in 1837. But the story it left behind still smolders, a warning about the dangers of blind faith, unchecked authority, and the monstrous acts that can hide behind the mask of virtue. The Hudson family thrived because they understood something fundamental about human nature. People long for moral certainty, and they will trust those who claim to provide it. By exploiting that desire, the Hudsons committed crimes that would have been unthinkable without the shield of religious authority. Their downfall raised questions that were as unsettling as the crimes themselves. If one institution could hide such horrors behind the mask of charity, how many others might be doing the same? Commissioner Caldwell's team identified at least a dozen other reform facilities across New York and New England, showing suspicious patterns, identical letters, financial irregularities, unexplained disappearances. None were as monstrous or as complete as the Hudson operation, but several were exposed for fraud, abusive methods, and exploitation. The case made it clear that the Hudsons were not an isolated aberration. They were the most extreme example of a much wider danger. The legacy of their crimes stretched far beyond Ulster County. The case became a reference point in debates about religious authority, institutional oversight, and the vulnerability of women and other marginalized groups to systematic abuse. It also provided some of the earliest documented evidence of techniques that would later be recognized as central to totalitarian control. Breaking down identity, enforcing obedience through fear, and convincing victims that their suffering was sacred. For the women who survived liberation was only the beginning. Many lived with what we now recognize as trauma. Margaret Sutherland described it in her memoir. We had been taught to distrust our own perceptions, to doubt our own worth, and to accept suffering as evidence of spiritual progress. Learning to think and feel for ourselves again was a process that took years, and some of us never fully succeeded in reclaiming the people we had been before our captivity. Their scars, emotional, physical, spiritual, never truly healed. The state of New York eventually paid out over $200,000 in compensation to the families of victims, at the time one of the largest financial settlements in American history. More than money, it established a precedent. When governments fail to prevent systematic abuse, they share responsibility for the harm done. The Hudson case echoed through American culture for decades. Novelists and journalists turned it into a symbol of hidden evil lurking behind respectable facades. Reform movements cited it as proof that oversight was essential. And ordinary people remembered it as a lesson in how easily communities can be deceived when they choose faith and authority over the evidence of their own eyes. The ruins of the House of Religious Correction eventually disappeared. Its stones carried off and its grounds left empty. But the story refused to fade. The Hudsons taught America that the greatest danger does not always come from those who look like villains. Sometimes it comes from those who look like saviors, those who speak the language of virtue while building empires of cruelty in the shadows of trust. As time passed and the shock of the Hudson revelations faded, the story slipped into legend. In Ulster County, people whispered about the mansion's ruins. Some said the spirits of murdered women still lingered there. Others claimed Patrick Hudson had bargained with the devil himself. These ghost stories, while understandable attempts to explain the inexplicable, obscured the far more unsettling truth. The real horror wasn't supernatural. It was human. 3 educated, respected individuals convinced themselves and their community that systematic cruelty was sacred duty. That was far more frightening than any tale of restless spirits. The Hudson case remains one of the clearest examples of how ordinary people can become instruments of extraordinary evil, when cloaked in the language of morality and redemption. Patrick, Kathleen, and Sean succeeded not because they were clever criminals, but because they knew what their community wanted to believe. That redemption was possible. That shame could be erased. And that religious authority once invoked was almost beyond question. Their story endures as a warning. Whenever institutions claim moral authority while hiding their operations from scrutiny, whenever families are told to sever contact with loved ones, whenever suffering is reframed as proof of spiritual progress, the conditions exist for systematic abuse. Abuse that can last for years, hidden in plain sight. The Hudsons' reign ended in fire and death in 1837, but the lessons they left behind still echo. They remind us that the most terrifying monsters are rarely supernatural. They are ordinary people who discover that they can destroy lives while convincing themselves and others that they are serving a higher purpose. That delusion makes them far more dangerous than any open villainy. So what do you think? Was everything truly uncovered, or were there other institutions hiding similar crimes behind walls of prayer and charity? Leave your thoughts in the comments. And If you want more stories like this, true horrors pulled from the forgotten shadows of America's past, make sure to subscribe, hit the bell, and share this with someone who loves dark mysteries. Because next time we'll open another chapter of history that official records tried to bury. Thank you all very much for watching my video until the end. I sincerely appreciate it, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video.